warmly, everyone. My name is Michał Baranowski. I'm a director of GMF Warsaw, and I'm here with
Andrzej Bobiński. Hi, I'm the head of Polityka Insight, a Center for Policy Analyses in Warsaw.
Fantastic to see good friends on the screen and on the other side of the camera. Welcome to everyone in Warsaw, in Washington, in Paris, Brussels, Berlin, and I'm sure some other places as well. On behalf of GMF, for those who don't know GMF, GMF is a transatlantic think tank with offices in all those places, and we are super excited to be joining with Polityka Insight, who we think are the smartest people in town on analyzing Polish politics, economics, and foreign relations. So we are very glad to partner up with Polityka Insight, where we hope to bring also perspective from the outside.
Thank you very much, Michał. We're very excited to be doing this, and thank you for taking the time to speak to us and to tell us what the perspective is for Poland in France, Germany, and the United States. I think what we'd like to do is to start with a question to Wojtek Szacki, if he's online. We can't see him. I don't know if he's going to appear at some point. But basically, the question I wanted to ask him was who won this election and why? Wojtek, can you hear us?
So as Wojtek is turning on his camera, hopefully, let me just remind everyone who doesn't follow the Polish politics on an everyday basis, and everyone on this screen has been doing this for sure. We had the second round of the election took place last Sunday. President Duda won with 51.03% of the vote. Rafał Trzaskowski received 48.97% of the vote, and the turnout was 68.2%, which is the highest turnout since 1995. I see that Wojtek is unmuting. It's a good question whether he's able to join us with the camera. So, but I began answering Andrzej's question, who won, in terms of the election itself. But Wojtek, can you join us to tell us a little bit more why?
I can hear you, but I don't know if you can hear me.
Okay, what I propose we do is we wait for Wojtek to figure out the technical issues, and maybe we're going to start with Marek Świerczyński and ask you, Marek, what do you think this means, without going into internal politics, what do you think this victory, Andrzej Duda's victory, means for Poland's foreign policy, foreign and defense policy?
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I think we will see a lot of continuation. We may see some adaptation, and we can expect some changes, but I wouldn't expect any major shift, at least for the time being. First of all, the continuation part. Of course, this is because the Polish security and defense policy is largely shaped by external situation and also by external forces to a certain degree, which will not change strategically in the coming months and years. That is, you know, NATO's response and EU's response to the Russian threat will continue evolving, and also to other security challenges, including the US military presence in Europe and also in Poland. This also will continue, as well as the ongoing transformation of the Polish armed forces and the Polish defense doctrines and policies will continue to go on. So this will probably remain on track. And of course, the main factor of this continuation is the fact that both in terms of legislative and as well as executive powers, the recent elections brought confirmation of this right-wing ruling camp, which has defined its security and defense goals quite clearly, and they have adopted implementation of it. That is, you know, first of all, the strengthening of bilateral security link with the United States, with the expansion of the US military presence throughout the so-called eastern flank and also in Poland, they have put emphasis on enhancement as to the shape and form of the Polish military and creating some new security structures in the regions, including with the countries between the Baltic, Black and Adriatic Sea, the initiatives called the Free Seas and Tri-Seas initiatives. I'm sure you know all about that. There is also continuity in terms of Poland's willingness to continue contributing to wider security arrangements, including NATO missions and operations, UN peacekeeping. We have just returned last year to the Lebanon UN mission, and also to the EU defense and security cooperation schemes. Well, in respect to the latter, we can of course discuss how whether the level of Polish ambitions really represent the potential of the country, but at least there is no reluctance to contribute and take part. And I can also say there is also continuity on the US side of the equation. First of all, to remain engaged in NATO's eastern flank, including Poland, and that Poland is actually it has already become, or is in the process of becoming, the hub for US forces and for US activities in the region, maybe regardless of whatever change there may or may not be in the White House in the result of November elections. Because as we know, both the military of the United States, as well as the majority of political factions, is supporting continuation of the US presence and US activities, barring for a total NATO pullout, which is at least at the moment not quite on the horizon. So there will be a lot of continuity for those reasons, but there may be some adaptation, and the adaptation may come from the fact, of course, of Joe Biden arriving to the White House, and we will see what change in narratives that will bring on both sides. I would emphasize the word narratives, because as I said, the strategic foundation of both the US policies in respect to Poland, and of course the Polish policies towards the United States will probably remain intact. There will also be some adaptation to economic realities if they hit hard after the COVID-19 crisis. And so far we have seen the authorities in Poland keeping the public somewhat isolated from the hard figures that may come in result of that crisis. But there may be also some impact on the defense budget and wider defense policies. And of course, I would say probably the largest impact in strategic terms and the largest adaptation that we may face in the coming years, maybe not months, is the China issue. If it becomes a very serious matter on the forum of NATO and the EU. And I would say that probably this area, the strategic rivalry between the US, China, and Russia, is something that we will need to think very strongly about how to adapt to and how to fit into in order not to lose the gains that we've gained in recent years in respect to defense and deterrence and also the wider security policies. I will stop now, and I'm ready to continue discussions with you if there will be any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Marek. I'm happy to see that Wojtek has joined us. Wojtek, can you see us? Can you hear us? I think you need to unmute now. We can see you, we need to hear you. Okay, Wojtek, the question the question that you were asked was who won and why. Michał covered the who won bit. So if you could quickly tell us why Andrzej Duda won and what this means for Polish politics for say the next 24 months.
Well, first of all, Andrzej Duda won because well, he managed to mobilize most of his base, and because of the high turnout in the countryside, it was a long-time tradition in Poland that people in the countryside didn't vote as often as people in the cities, and right now it has changed, and the turnout in the countryside was almost as high as in the cities, and the support of Andrzej Duda was much higher in the countryside than the support for Rafał Trzaskowski, and I guess this is the basic reason why Andrzej Duda won the election. And also, well, he was a clear favorite of the election since the beginning of the campaign. He has a bigger base, more devoted fans. He's supported by the biggest political party in Poland, the ruling party, with all the tools that the government has to support the candidate. And it all played well in his campaign, whereas Rafał Trzaskowski had to gather different types of electorate, not only from liberal opposition, but also from the left, and also some conservative voters, and also some voters of Christoph, the right-wing candidate. And he basically didn't have a big chance of winning this election. And so the result of the election didn't come as a surprise, even though Rafał Trzaskowski received over 10 million votes, which was widely expected to be enough, but Andrzej Duda had 10.4 million votes. And this was the second best result in the history of Polish presidential elections. Only Lech Wałęsa 30 years ago had 200,000 votes more than Andrzej Duda now.
Okay, Wojtek, and could you tell us what this means for the coming months for Poland? Do you think that this means that peace will be in charge, or do you think there is internal turmoil ahead? Do you think basically that we will see a continuation over the next 3 years until the next election, or do you think it's possible that something could still change, not in this election, but in elections to come, as in a snap election, for example?
Well, basically, I don't believe in a snap election right now. I guess Jarosław Kaczyński will be willing to use this time. He has 3 years without any domestic campaign to change the state, the institutions of the state, so that to build an institutional advantage over the opposition, so that he could win another election in 3 years' time. So Jarosław Kaczyński will have to first do some cleaning inside his camp. There will be a reshuffle of the government. I guess it's a matter of weeks, perhaps 2 months, before the reshuffle of the government. And then we will have internal elections within the ruling party.
Wojtek, it looks as if you muted yourself. I don't know. No, this just happened. Well, I can tell you, listeners, what Wojtek was about to say. I think he was about to say that Jarosław Kaczyński is going to win these internal elections, and that for the moment doesn't seem as if there's going to be a big change in law and justice in the coming weeks or months. So I think for the moment we're going to move on, Wojtek. Thank you for that. Sorry that you muted yourself, or that you were muted by your computer. And that was Wojtek Szacki, the head of our political desk. Now moving on to our European desk, Agnieszka Smoleńska, if you could answer a question, what the result of this election and the fact that peace is going to be in power means for European politics and for Polish politics, looking at the upcoming summits, the Budgetary Summit and the Climate Summit.
Okay, so thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. Now, the remarks that I will have are taken looking at, let's say, the way that this election has been portrayed in the media and also the internal discussion of European issues in the context of the election, which there has not been a lot of. So first of all, this is important to point out, European Union as such featured very marginally in these elections. It was a non-topic, despite the fact that both candidates were former MEPs, both had some experience in European issues. Europe as such did not feature prominently in these discussions, not least because the president's role in European policy is somewhat limited. For the past 5 years, it has sat firmly with the Chancellery, with the Prime Minister, and now this effect has been further reinforced with a certain reorganization of the ministry in Poland. So any effects on European policy are collateral rather than deliberate. So these are consequences rather than the results of the elections. And I would point to 3 specific dimensions in this regard. So first, you have the bilateral aspect, so President's cooperation with his partners across Europe. Secondly, you have the impact on the government policy and the government's relationship with Brussels. And thirdly, you have the wider aspect, and this is something that Michał actually touched upon in the discussion that you had last week before the elections. So this broader global context in which this election took place, and in particular the discussion between liberalism and illiberalism, authoritarianism and democracy, a discussion that is taking place in a number of countries. So starting with the bilateral aspect, this Duda won in competitive elections, and there is absolutely no doubt about this. Of course, there are certain reservations with regard to the media, but OSCE and international observers confirmed that this was a fair and competitive election. Therefore, on a diplomatic level, you are unlikely to see any deep consequences in terms of recognition of this president. Where you might have consequences is the, let's say, the perception of this president, because the rhetoric he has used has absolutely not gone unnoticed. So the signals that will be sent from other capitals will not be direct, they will rather be informal and indirect, because I don't think also there is full realization here how disturbing have been some of the statements which have been made by the Prime Minister with regard to the minorities. And this includes LGBT minorities, but also the Jewish minority. So you might certainly have a certain distancing from the president, maybe some formats, diplomatic exchanges which have been planned, such as the Weimar Triangle Summit. Maybe they will take place in another form. Maybe we'll have an input on this from the Paris side. Now, when it comes to the EU government and to the EU government relationship, this will of course depend on what course the government will take, especially on policies such as the media, further reform of the judiciary, and any limitations of freedom of speech. There has been a lot of sophisticated analysis already on how EU could respond, and in particular how the EU will solve a trilemma between, on the one hand, then there's a trilemma, 3 hands, but in the one corner, respecting rule of law, in the second, keeping engagement with the Polish society and not risking alienating Polish society, which even though is very Europhile, you have some, let's say, foreboding of possible distancing from European issues. And thirdly, not wasting political capital on pursuing this debate when it's not the debate concerning rule of law, which is not bringing concrete results. So there has been a lot of sophisticated analysis trying to predict how capitals will react and also what the Polish government will do. But I think it's important to remember that we are still in the economic crisis. This will be the worst economic crisis that the EU will face, and just the priorities are different. So a number of commentators have pointed to, and I think rightly, that we might see from Brussels more of a policy of appeasement and managing Poland as a partner in European relations, rather than engaging with it constructively. Now, when it comes to the budgetary negotiations, where you might have, this is clearly visible because the main topics continue to be rule of law and climate neutrality, whereas the positive agenda that the Warsaw is trying to bring, in particular on very important issue of taxation, which as we have seen today continues to grapple a number of European citizens, here the Polish government's voice is not so much heard, partly because of the loss of trust and this perception of this government as not being let's say, fully participating, let's say, in the European discussion. And this is not, this is also taking into account the demand for active Polish involvement in European politics. What you might have, therefore, just to summing up this part, is management of the relations rather than engagement in a policy, let's say, of appeasement, trying to manage. This is not, however, without certain instrumentalization of certain policies of Polish government, in particular concerning economic nationalism, where the Polish policy of stronger role of the state is in economic policy is something that resonates in a number of the bigger capitals, in particular France and Germany. So in particular with regard to competition policy, industrial policy, you might still see a lot of engagement with Warsaw on this issue. And just to finalize on the third point, so this broader discussion on the authoritarianism, illiberalism, because you can see a lot of commentators trying to draw lessons from what has happened in Poland for the conflict between the liberals and illiberals across the globe. And there I would caution, because even though you can see in Trzaskowski's campaign a very successful attempt to engage with a number of populist issues, in particular with regard to responding to the social and economic concerns rather than the big debate between openness and closeness, which the liberal side often favors, there we have to keep certain proportions. So I would also caution in this approach of seeing this election as a fork in the road or some kind of definitive resolution to the question of how do we revert let's say, the populist forces across Europe. So these would be my introductory points. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Agnieszka. That was perfect. Back to Wojtek for a moment. Wojtek Szacki, are you with us and are you able to unmute yourself? Yes. Okay, Wojtek, quick question from Phyllis Berry. The question is, and this concerns and touches upon something that Agnieszka mentioned. Do you think that there was an even playing field in this election? Do you feel that the public media and the state intervened in these elections? So basically, was there an even playing field?
I have no doubt that the state institutions helped Andrzej Duda a lot. I mean, it was not only the prime minister who traveled all over Poland promising money for the local governments and praising Andrzej Duda. I guess it helped increase the turnout in the rural areas. Also, the Minister of Internal Affairs promised 49 fire trucks to increase the turnout, because the local communities with the highest turnout were promised to get a fire truck. And it was a clear message for all the voters in those areas, then if they go to the election, their community will get a fire truck from the government, and it was only for the rural communities, this whole program. And also the state TV was clearly on the side of Andrzej Duda, and all the information broadcast by public television was supposed to destroy Rafał Kaczyński's, to destroy Rafał Trzaskowski's chances of winning the election. It wasn't only that was favorable for Andrzej Duda, but they said a lot about, for example, how Trzaskowski would take away money from the social programs carried out by the government and give it away to Jews. So it's definitely played a part in Duda's victory, what the state-owned TV did throughout the campaign. And I wouldn't call it an even field.
Yeah, I think what we can fairly safely say is that this was a free and unfair election, and I don't know what the OEC would say to this, but I think that basically this is what it boils down to. Over to you, Michał.
Thank you very much. So we had a view from Poland looking out, and now we want to have a view from the outside world looking toward Poland. Just one little note on housekeeping, just for everyone who joined us a little bit later. This is on the record, it's being recorded, so if you want to, you can watch it later or share it with your friends. You have ability to ask questions either through the chat function or through Q&A function. We'll wait with most of the questions until later on. I actually just have a question also from Ambassador Nicol, former ambassador of Germany to Poland, with a very good question, but let me first go to our colleagues in Washington, Paris and Berlin. So let me actually start with Susan. Susan Corke, Senior Fellow at GMF and the Director of Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. Susan, tell us how the election is being viewed from Washington, D.C. Marek, in his introduction, also mentioned that your election and the outcome of the November presidential election, whether this is going to be second term of President Trump or new President Biden, will play a role also very much on the domestic scene. So if you could also at some point put on a little bit of a view with those two scenarios playing out. Susan, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Michał. Is my audio coming out okay? Okay. Hello to everyone. There has been, as Michał mentioned, considerable interest in the Polish election in DC because this election was, of course, occurring against the backdrop of the pandemic. In the lead up to the first scheduled date in May, in the US, it was really viewed as a test case for balancing democracy against a health emergency. And American policymakers over here, you may have seen that in the United States, voting by mail has become a very politicized issue. So there was close attention paid to Poland, watching as they navigated the dangers of politicizing the measures needed to ensure a safe, free, and fair vote. And it was, fair to say, I think it was a roller coaster in Poland, and it may be in the United States. And in the US, it was also viewed as a real test for populism, whether it had enduring support in Poland. Many of the themes that were conjured in the campaign period in Poland feel very similar to what we're going through right now in America. It was a pretty ugly campaign, at least as viewed through what we were reading in the media. The election was framed in very stark terms as a divided electorate and a referendum on Polish identity, that this was a choice between a traditional Poland or a rainbow Poland with liberal values. a choice between the real Poland and an urban elite, a lot of fear-mongering against the other, inflammatory language. And as if you've been watching the US election, our incumbent in the US is also using these weapons to divide the country. And he's even turned masks into a divisive issue of identity in the US. I think it was really telling that President Duda, faced with uncertainty late in the campaign and the late-breaking popularity of Trzaskowski, that he gambled that the vote of support that he needed was from President Trump and made the last-ditch visit to Washington just days before the election. That visit was widely criticized on both sides of the aisle in DC. It was seen as improper. It was seen as personalizing the bilateral relationship to one unpopular president who may not win in a second term. I think so. President Duda moving forward is going to need to think about that. Of course, Trump too has been happy to play into that dynamic and personalize the relationship. In his response to President Duda winning the second term, said, "Congratulations to my friend, President Andrzej Duda. He's looking forward to continuing our important work." So, the stakes were certainly high for Poland's future as a democracy, and people are very worried here in the United States, or particularly I represent the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, which is a bilateral group of transatlanticists, both in the security and the democracy realm. And there's a lot of worry that President Duda will be a rubber stamping president and give the Law and Justice Party a clear path to consolidate the liberal rule. I've said and written that the important thing for the United States is also that it was a free and fair election that produced a legitimate outcome. And I will say that it was a competitive election, high turnout. It was a democratic outcome, but it was a tilt. We were just talking about that. It was a tilted field that favored the incumbent, and the OSC monitoring team said that the election was well managed, but there are a lot of gaps and hostility, threats against the media, misuse of state resources. So, there were definitely deficiencies in the election, but the outcome was democratic. With the U.S. election underway, it's hard to predict some things. No matter what, Poland is going to be continue to be a valued bilateral and NATO ally, whether it's Trump or Biden. We know Russia will continue to be a threat. I think we have a sense of the path that Trump will continue. Under Democratic administration, I believe there will be less bilateral favoritism and a greater emphasis on strengthening multilateral institutions. I think that there will be more support from the United States in supporting the EU's efforts to hold members accountable to EU commitments. I think that as far as, troops in Poland, I think that, issues like that will continue to move forward, but I think that there will be a greater emphasis on handling those issues within NATO, not just in the bilateral realm. There's been some speculation about what Biden's priorities will be, but he has a long history of prioritizing the transatlantic alliance. There is some concern that he'll be overly concerned with getting back to normal. And there will be some kind of going back to how things were and not understanding that this is really a system altering moment, and that there should also be a focus on looking to new solutions so that the transatlantic alliance can better meet new challenges. I think it's safe to say that the expectations here are that peace will continue its liberal path, starting with picking up its fight with the independent media. And I think it's safe to say that under Biden that America would again stand up for human rights and democracy. So that would be an area of potential friction between the US and Poland. And I should say that, on the independent media issue, that is one issue, even under the Trump administration, where there is bilateral concern. So even in a Trump administration, if Poland continues to crack down on independent media, that will be something that will be a real issue in the bilateral relationship. The Congress has been very strong on that, and there's some bills underway in Congress looking to increase support for independent media. But in short, I think that Biden will have a more pro-Western foreign policy, and he should also, and this is my hope, that he would encourage bridge building both in our own country and encourage that with President Duda as a partner. And then I'll just end by saying that, you know, I think Biden too, there's, you know, not to be overly optimistic, but I think the focus would be on repairing a lot of the damage and really reprioritizing Europe as a whole and individual relationships, and rejoining Paris Climate Agreement, pursuing new trade deals, cooperative efforts for technology innovation, and really looking to revive trust in America's commitment to values in the world. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you very much for bringing the perspective from Washington and playing with those two scenarios of Trump 2.0 and Biden's administration. Let me now jump on our side of the Atlantic and go first to our colleague in Paris and then switch to voices from Berlin. Martin Quencez, Martin, fantastic to have you with us. Martin is the Deputy Director of our Paris office. Tell us how the election is being seen in Paris. What's important?
Well, thank you, Michał, and hello, everyone. Very happy to share with you some views from Paris. Maybe two main points. One is how the results were covered by the French media and analysts, and I think it gives you a sense of, in a way, how France, the population and the policymakers, what kind of lessons learned we will draw from this election. And the second point on what we should expect for the future of the French-Polish bilateral relationship. So in the press, the media coverage was kind of unanimous in having three main takeaways. One is that the election, well, the victory went to the favorite candidate, but it was kind of close, and this is in a way a surprise as far as the French press covered the result. This was this very contested result, and the question now is whether for peace the lessons learned is that it validates their campaign, or it actually should be seen as a warning that well, they got quite close to a surprise and therefore should change their position, especially on values and on the EU. Now, of course, there's a lot of wishful thinking, but here in Paris, there is hope that the results will give President Duda and peace a sense of a warning that going too much to the right and to a conservative agenda is not perhaps the most successful strategy, and that there will be a need to reconcile Poland and the two Polands that have emerged out of this election, and therefore there is hope in France that this will be the main lesson learned for the peace. The second takeaway is that it's a kind of a validation of this divide between cities and countryside, cities and small towns that we see in France, that we see in so many European countries and in North America. I think this is something that for the French media is remarkable, because this is something obviously that we experience directly here, and it shows in a way for Macron that this is likely to be the geographical divide as well for his re-election in 2022. And the third takeaway is, well, the very high turnout. And this is quite different from what we've experienced here in France with especially local elections with only 45% turnout. This is something that is remarkable as far as the French media is concerned, and shows in a way some kind of a democratic health going on in Poland, something that is troubling for Macron when we look what's happening in France. So based on these few analysis, it informs in a way the way the French government will interact with the Polish government in the years to come. I think we should expect a lot of continuation. It's no secret that the relationship has been kind of rocky over the last few years, and that there was a hope that there could be a new chapter after this election. In fact, there will be probably a continuation of an attempt to rebuild a more positive bilateral relationship with Warsaw, something that we've seen with Macron's visit to Poland earlier this year, but very little, in a way, more concrete policies that could bridge the gap between the two countries in terms of values, in terms of our position in the European Union, in terms of our position on some kind of key priorities for Macron, such as climate change. There is very little that can be seen as a sign of optimism coming out of this election. I would say also that there is this sense in France that whatever the election, whatever the result, you cannot do without Poland. So, and I agree with what was said before. It was not for Paris a turning point in the Franco-Polish relationship. Whether Macron feels more comfortable with President Duda or with his opponent matters very little in the end. What we've seen over the last 3 years is that Macron's great European ambition cannot be implemented if he doesn't reach out to Central and Eastern European countries, and in particular to Poland. This is clearly one of the lessons learned of the last 3 years for Paris. This will continue, and this is something that we should expect will guide France's policy towards Warsaw until 2022. And finally, the main contentious issues will not change either. So we know Russia, we know defense industrial projects will remain kind of the point of tensions between Warsaw and Paris. There's very little hope that there will be an agreement or even some kind of a rapprochement between the two countries on these issues. And I think we should not imagine that there could be kind of a breakthrough in the years to come. And I'll just finish with one kind of thought that is very much also in line with what was said before. The defining points will come from external factors. So the US elections will truly be seen for France as the turning point for the European project, and potentially put Poland and France into opposite camps. So if you have a Trump election in November, there you can imagine a quick deterioration of the bilateral relationship. And I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Martin. Very interesting. It's a joke, but it almost seems like we are having a bit of a third round of election here on November, happening in Washington, D.C. Let me now come even closer to Poland and turn to Christoph von Marschall from Berlin, editor and foreign diplomatic correspondent in the Tagesspiegel, but also a former fellow at EMF. Christoph could even switch to Polish, but because we are speaking in English, we'll keep it to English. Christoph, relations with Germany have not only been an issue, a foreign policy issue, but really almost an identity issue brought forward in this election. What extent? What is the reaction that you are seeing right now in Berlin, and how do you see the election of President Duda can impact both bilateral relationship, but also Berlin's perception of Poland within the EU? Christoph, over to you.
Dziękuję, Michał. It's great to be back with the GMF family, to see people in Washington, D.C., where I spent 10 months in 2017-18 for my book as the first Helmut Schmidt Fellow, but also to see Martin à Paris, who also helped me with the French angle for my book, and of course, people in Warsaw. Well, the reaction in Germany, it's a mixture of, I would say, 4 main feelings. This is disappointment, hope, fear, and warnings. So clearly, the majority in Germany would have hoped for a different outcome, probably also in the government. But as you know, we practice diplomatic politeness. So neither from our Bundespräsident Steinmeier nor from the government, you could see any open expression of this disappointment. The federal president congratulated Duda to the victory. Of course, if you want to read something into that note, you would also notice that he wished Duda a good hand to keep the Polish nation united. And he hoped also that they can both together do more for a good neighborly relationship. So you can interpret that positively or as a sort of polite criticism. It was much more open when you look at the foreign policy experts in the different political parties, let's say Mr. Wadepool in the CDU or Mr. Sarrazin with the Green Party, and the same would be true for the Social Democrats and others. They rather said that they hope on one hand that President Duda interprets the outcome, the narrow outcome of the election as a warning sign, but also as a mandate to unite now the nation, not to continue this policy which is rather dividing this society. But the hope rather turns then into the fear that that will not happen, that it's rather the opposite, that PiS understands the outcome of the election as a mandate to continue with reforms, and then they would go to voices like Justice Minister Jobro, who want to continue justice reform and the reform of the courts, or they would turn to people who said that they want to continue with the repolonization of the media, which is clearly directed to German companies like Springer or the Passauer Verlagsgruppe, who hold a lot of control over Polish media, didn't try to interfere as far as I see it, or most people in Germany see it, but they were attacked also during the campaign. So we had a clear anti-German note, at least from the side of President Duda, who also expressed his anger over a column of a German correspondent, and he named him by name, Mr. Fritz. Of course, I think he just used it because Fritz is a synonym for all Germans and not just because this special person is Mr. Fritz. But all this was noticed over here. It was understood that this is an election where anti-German feelings might be tested, whether you can take advantage of that or not. It is also noticed the geographical divide, that all the voivodstva, the regions in the west and the southwest and the north voted pro-Trzaskowski, the east and the south voted pro-Duda. So all what is close to the German-Polish border is not Trzaskowski or PO land, it's not Duda land, at least in the majority. So there are a lot of angles. So disappointment over the outcome, one would have hoped that it's rather Trzaskowski victory, which would give more control and more divided power to both camps. There was the hope that Duda and the PiS will understand this as a warning sign, and also that an encouragement to really use now the possibility to unite the country, but mixed with the fear that it will not happen, that it is rather will turn out differently. So rather, here's the interpretation that for the next 3 years, at least, a little bit more than 3 years, we will have to do with another attempt of PiS to gain more power and to get a structural grip on power positions in the media, in the government and the administration, and that this is not the best for German-Polish relations, for cooperation, whether it is at the border or whether it is in the European Union. And Poland will rather become or continue to be a rather difficult partner in the European Union on one hand. On the other hand, a country which you can't overlook and where we need to do business with, also when it now comes to the budget discussions at the summit at the end of this week. I would think that according to the government, we have a little bit a different look on it than in the society. In the German society, in the German media, the budget conflict is mainly presented as a conflict between southern countries like Italy and Spain and northern frugal countries like the Netherlands and Austria. But the Central Eastern European angle is very often overlooked, and it's not seen by the public and by the media. I think the government sees it clearly that the Central Eastern European states are more than 10 out of the 27 member states, so they have a certain weight and they have a certain say, and there might be rather the fear that the south and the central east of the EU could unite against the richer countries in the north. So that is the European angle, that business in the EU under German presidency will not become easier through the election results in Poland. And the last angle, I just pointed out to make a little bit this difference to what Susan Corke gave us, or Martin from Paris. There's certainly not a feeling that the Polish outcome or the outcome in November in the United States could be a template what is happening in Germany. Here's rather the feeling that that the society here, that the elections here are totally different. Of course, we have also this division between the bigger cities and the countryside when you look at election results, but it is not that feeling that this is mainly what drives German politics, or that we could end up there where we see the steep division of the political camps in the United States and in Poland. Germany is rather, or feels itself a little bit more consensus driven. And if at all, I would say that many Germans still have difficulties to understand what is happening in Poland, but also difficulties to respect what is happening outside of their borders, because there is always this sort of feeling of a moral superiority, that we have more understanding for minorities and we have the better energy policy or whatever. So that is dividing us. Thank you, Michał. I was just at the end of my remarks.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Thank you very much, and we'll have a lot of follow-up questions also for the perspective from Berlin. Questions are coming through chat, from Q&A, through other channels. So Andrzej and I will try to organize them a little bit. But maybe I can actually we can continue with another voice from Berlin, but also a Polish-speaking voice. Rolf Nickel, former ambassador to Poland, currently vice president at DGAP, a good friend. Rolf will be able to unmute you, so you can weigh in both with your comments and your question. And I see that you unmuted, so over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here and for giving me the opportunity to say just a few words. Actually, I was just wanted to ask one question, which is we have seen during the campaign sort of an instrumentalization of Germany. On the one hand, the attack on Mr. Fritz, as Christoph and Marschall already pointed out. We've also seen that the new German ambassador, this is my successor, is waiting for a very long time for his agreement. It's come as a little bit as a surprise, since Andrzej Duda formerly on a number of occasions had said that he would like to be considered as an attorney for good Polish-German relations. So that was a little bit of a surprise. And my question here really is there any evidence that this instrumentalization worked one way or the other? And secondly, is there any concern amongst anybody on the panel that there may be some retaliation from the side of Germany? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rolf. Great to have you with us. We were here comparing notes with Andrzej, and we thought we'll pass this question to Wojtek Szacki to take on first. Wojtek.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you for this question. I guess there is no evidence that it helped, but there is also no evidence that it didn't help. And my take is that it is traditional for the right-wing parties to seek an enemy, especially a foreign enemy, and Germans are a very good target, along with Jews and sometimes refugees from Islamic countries, and the ruling right-wing parties often use this as a weapon, as a tool to mobilize its voters, its base, especially in the rural areas. And it comes together with an attack on German media, or so-called German media in Poland. The ruling camp says that they were attacked first by tabloid Fact, which suggested that Andrzej Duda gave pardon to a pedophile, together with the photos of Andrzej Duda and the description of this crimes committed by this pedophile. So they felt they were under attack, and they struck back. And I guess it could give them, unfortunately, some votes.
I think the second question that Ambassador Michał asked was, is anybody worried about the state of Polish-German relations? I don't know, Agnieszka, Marek, would you venture an opinion? Are people worried?
I could start, and then I pass on the word. I would say that there are two things to look out at. One is the politicization of diplomacy in Poland. So if you see an active engagement of a number of people from the foreign ministry who are very active also in the party, and this is therefore this subjugation of diplomatic interests to the party interest is something that is quite visible. On the other hand, you of course have the economic aspect, where absolutely there is worry, I would say, because it was very strong language, it was quite aggressive, so the worry that this could have repercussions is absolutely there. So I'm sure there's also thinking of how damage control in this situation should be pursued. At the same time, I would say that the context of the German presidency is also quite important in terms of expectation of certain retaliation, because obviously for the next 6 months at least, Germany has to be the honest broker across the EU, so its capacity to retaliate in any form would not be very well seen in other European member states as well. So this is, let's say, the analytical answer to the question.
And if I may just add, the dimension that I'm working on a daily basis, just as we speak here, there is another discussion taking place in Warsaw, namely between AKK, the German defense minister, and Polish defense minister Mariusz Błaszczak. AKK, of course, is coming to Warsaw, I would say, by a EU and NATO rule book. maybe that Poland is a major contributor to defense in the NATO eastern flank, and Germany is taking over EU presidency, and Germany is in discussion with the United States about the basing of US troops, etc., and it is advisable at least to come and visit Poland. But if there is some kind of damage control taking place by the Polish government, I don't know but if there is one, I would imagine that Mr. Błaszczak is the first one to communicate the real non-campaign position of the Polish government, which, as I said in my introductory remarks, is one of at least not being reluctant to cooperate, and at least not being against any EU and especially NATO cooperation. To the contrary, Poland should be, and at least officially is, fully agreeable to deepening defense and security cooperation in Europe. But to Ambassador Nikol's question, I was actually surprised that you, Ambassador, were surprised to see those anti-German sentiments re-emerging in the Polish campaign, because it seems as though it is an ABC of the right-wing political camp that, as Wojtek Szacki mentioned, they were always raising the Polish-German issues in political campaigns. They were always looking for some external enemies. And of course, since the general climate of Polish-German relations is perhaps not in its heights, it was no surprise, at least to me, that the Polish-German issue was again used as a tool or as a weapon in this political campaign.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka and Marek. We'll now switch to a lot of the questions that came through chat and Q&A. There were a number of them about media and freedom of the media, and also reactions in both Washington and Berlin. So paraphrasing a little bit, a question from Ambassador of Canada, of Canada in Poland, Leslie Scanlon. She was asking basically whether there is an expectation that US, so that's a question to Susan, whether there is expectations that US might play the card of security and defense cooperation with Poland in defense of media if the media came under pressure. And maybe if then I could ask someone from the Polityka Insight team whether there is a worry about this. But Susan, just briefly on whether the US, you think, could, would, should play this card. Thanks.
Sure. Interesting question. So again, the answer would be somewhat different in a Trump or Biden administration. And in the Trump administration, this for us was one of the few areas where we were able to find some bipartisan consensus and concern. And, the US ambassador in Poland, as a businesswoman, was receptive to the arguments that, foreign media in Poland, the pressure, it's important for the business climate. So I don't think under a Trump administration, you would see the willingness to play a central role. This is also happening at the same time that there's been a lot of uproar in DC about the new head of US Agency for Global Media, Michael Pack, firing the heads of Radio for Europe and the other networks, and potentially, politicizing and turning that into a propaganda type outlet. So broadly speaking, the Trump administration has not been critical of such moves and has been replicating some of them, but there has been, we've been kind of helping to piece together those on both sides of the aisle, in and out of government, who care about that. And Congress has been very strong, and their approach right now on encouraging media freedom is to do it from a regional perspective. And that it's important for the resiliency of democracy and encouraging the National Endowment for Democracy to fund more there. And there's $20 million being considered in the current foreign operations bill. So in the US, it's kind of this piecemeal approach, but altogether it adds up to, you know, that's one of the few priority bipartisan issues. Under a Biden administration, I think that there will be more willingness to be unified in public about those concerns and be something that we would be expecting out of the relationship. And, you know, that there might be, but I don't know that there would be a willingness to kind of consolidate an approach, again, because that has been a sensitive issue with Poland, and it probably will continue to be with President Duda, but I do think you would see more pressure from the United States on that issue, and that there would be more funding from, you know, the State Department, USAID, and to the National Endowment for Democracy towards supporting independent media in Poland.
Thank you very much, Susan. Marek, we'll turn to you, but there are a number of other questions that you might want to address at the same time. So we'll pile them up at you a little bit. Johannes is also asking about Poland's relations with China and the future of 5G. And also there was a question about future of Poland's relations with Ukraine, I believe, also from Johannes. So maybe we could take the US pressure or not, and then China and Ukraine for, you know,
So
1 minute, I think.
Yeah, very briefly. On media, I would very much echo Susan's opinion that it will depend largely on the outcome of the US elections, because I wouldn't expect any major action being taken under Trump's presidency if it will continue, certainly because you can see striking similarities in the language between what Mr. Trump says about media and what the Polish government and the Polish president says about media, regardless of the positions taken by the US ambassador here, Mrs. Georgette Mosbacher, who is acting, I would say, in an unorthodox way, to say the least. And I'm not quite sure whether her actions and her statements are really helping to promote the cause. Yes, she's been very vocal in defense of one specific media company owned by the US business, but I'm not sure that that her influence on the Polish government is that strong that it may change their actions. On China and 5G, we're still in the process of formulating our policies, and I would just think that the recent UK decision and the comment made by Donald Trump on that he actually owned that decision and claimed he was the real decisive power behind that decision. It may also influence the Polish decision makers. In the broader China context, we have a problem in Poland, because on one hand, we've been very keen on attracting Chinese investments in many fields before this current wave of anti-Chinese policies from the US. And actually, some of these investments proved quite beneficiary for the Polish economy in larger terms. And there is a big debate what to do about this problem, and I don't see any clear policies yet formulated by the government, maybe also because of the continuous election campaigns in Poland. But certainly, as I said in my introductory remarks, this is one of the key issues on the agenda. On Ukraine, we didn't see any real positive outcomes of the Zelensky presidency towards, Polish-Ukraine relations, we don't see any reapproachment on the difficult historical issues that we have with Ukraine. We're fine on the sort of the general threat assessment and security and defense policies, but this is driven mainly by the US and by NATO. And yes, we will probably look into some kind of reformulating of that policy. But again, this is probably not the key issue for peace government and also for Duda personally. And I guess we will need to wait another few months until the government, the peace government, the cabinet reforms itself after the success of the two elections and until the president formulates his goals for the new term.
Okay, Agnieszka, I have two questions for you from the panel. One is about an active engagement by Poland in shaping future EU policies in Andrzej Duda's second term. I think you sort of answered that in your introduction, but if you could sort of build on that. And a second question, which I think is very well suited to your interests. What was the reaction in Poland to the fact that Mr. Donoghue of Ireland became the chair of the Eurogroup? My guess is that one of the few people who noticed it in Poland was you. So, so if you could tell us, what do you think?
Okay, so starting with the active engagement in EU policies, it's I did touch upon it a little bit previously, as you mentioned. So first of all, the president doesn't play that big of a role. However, when it comes to active engagement, this is also preconditioned somewhat by the perception of Poland. So one policies where you see a lot of active, proactive engagement is the area of taxation. Where Poland is coming up with new ideas to solve the budgetary hole, which appeared after Brexit, specifically giving concrete proposals on digital tax and other possible new own resources. The problem is when your position is undermined as a result, for example, of the way that you do bilateral, you use or instrumentalize your partners, whether that undermines your ability to successfully upload even good ideas. And I think this taxation issue is one of the examples where you can see the consequences of your policies, even in those areas where you are looking for an active engagement. So when it comes to Mr. Donoghue and the chairmanship of the Eurogroup, I think it's a fascinating question. There were three candidates, and out of the three candidates for the Eurogroup position, the Irish Minister of Finance was the only one that referred directly to the inclusive format of the Eurogroup. That is the format where the 19 ministers of the Eurozone are joined by other ministers of finance across the EU when discussing very important topics such as relating to the future reform of the EMU. This openness expressed by Mr. Donoghue is in contrast to the approaches that probably would have been taken by Nadia Calvino, who was much more oriented towards consolidating the reform in the Eurozone and also expanding on the role of the budget in Eurozone economic policies, let's say it that way. So from the perspective of Warsaw, having chairman of the Eurogroup who is open is very important, even if it is not noticed, because it means that the voice of the Euro outs, which has significantly decreased with Brexit, and now with the expansion of the Eurozone to Croatia and Bulgaria planned for 2023, it's a very positive development from the perspective of Euro out, regardless of the question, which I think is still can be asked, whether it is not high time to have a broader discussion in Poland on the consequences of staying out in Europe after Brexit, and in Europe with where only 6 member states remain out of the Eurozone.
Okay, thank you, Agnieszka. I'm glad you could answer that question. A question to Wojtek Szacki. The question is about the emancipation of Andrzej Duda from his mentor, Jarosław Kaczyński. Do you believe that it is possible that Andrzej Duda in his second term will take a more centrist and less right-wing approach to politics?
I hope you can hear me. Sorry for all those technical problems. Well, in theory, I guess Andrzej Duda has a chance of becoming more independent because he will not be running for his third term. This is his second and last term. So in theory, he doesn't need the support of the party, and he might become a little bit more independent and more important player within the ruling camp. But I don't know if he is able to do so, and to at least try to become more powerful player and more powerful politician. I guess we will know more once his office will be created, whether he will be trying to find some experienced politicians and to enhance the presidential chancellery and presidential palace. But I don't know if he's psychologically able to do so. And also, I wouldn't expect a war against peace. I think that the links between Duda and peace are too close, and he knows that what for example, the state-owned TV will do to him if he starts to break the line and the unity of the ruling camp. So I wouldn't expect a major conflict between them. I would expect Andrzej Duda to find a way to become a little bit perhaps different from the ruling party. I would expect 1 veto per year, for example, not 5 vetoes per year. But I guess we will have to give him some time to reconsider and to think over the plans of his presidency.
Thank you very much, Wojtek. We now have also with us Lee Feinstein, former ambassador of US to Poland. We'll be able to unmute you, Lee, in just 1 second. There is also a couple of people raised hands, Klaus Wittmann, for example. If you could just maybe type it in the chat, your question, because we are trying to group them and it's not so easy to unmute people. So just let us know, and we are doing our best. We probably not be able to answer all the questions, but we are doing our best. Lee, good to see you virtually in Poland. Over to you, and we'll unmute you right now. You are unmuted. Try one more time. There you go.
Thanks everyone for an excellent conversation. It's terrific to be able to hear from all these different transatlantic perspectives. I had a question about, and Susan Corke addressed this, as did others, if there were to be a Biden administration in the United States, whether cooperation between the United States and Europe on rule of law issues could be more effective than the approach now, where the United States and the European Union were on different sides of this question? Or do you think that more likely a Polish government would just seek to wait out any kind of diplomatic pressure that it saw?
Thank you, Lee, very much for this. I'm thinking that maybe we'll go to Marek with this question. Hopefully we are not surprising you, Marek, too much with this. Okay.
No, of course, I was listening to Ambassador Feinstein. As I said, I would probably think about the answer in terms of who wins the election in the United States first, and then how will the EU new power structure emerge after COVID and after, because COVID has made some pause in the shaping of new EU directions. If those two combine, if Biden comes to power and there will be some more traditional approach to US external policies, combined with some more pro-democracy oriented European approach, including stronger emphasis on rule of law linked to, for instance, EU funding, then the leverage will be really strong on Polish authorities. Otherwise, I cannot see real pressure tools in hands of those who would like to exert that pressure.
Thank you very much, Marek. We are slowly coming to the end. We have a couple other questions, but for those participants, if you can, this is your last real chance to ask a question. We have one question that we haven't yet asked that goes to Christoph von Marschall. It's also in relation to the media. I think a lot of participants are concerned about the role of the media in Polish politics. But there are really two, and I'll ask both of them. One was about whether you would expect, Christoph, any pushback, more active pushback from Berlin if indeed there was an effort to colonize, deconcentrate ownership of media in Poland, especially that have German ownership. The second question actually flipped, so to say. There was one question from Jakub asking whether, and maybe that's to you, Christoph, maybe it's to others, whether we have in fact seen an undue influence of foreign media, not public media, in Polish politics. I would also ask that you all think about your the panelists, last things that you could, that you want to weigh in, and we'll do a lightning closing round after Christoph's answer. Thanks.
Well, when it comes to the pushback against the repolonization of so-called German media in Poland or Polish media owned by German companies, I don't think this would mainly go through Berlin. I rather think that the German government would say this is a question of the internal market, it is a Brussels issue, it is oversight over the general market of businesses, and they would try to avoid to address this as a special German-Polish question. In background talks, it might be different, but I think in the public domain, they would rather think that it's a Brussels question and not a German-Polish question. But as already Agnieszka and others pointed out, there is this general feeling that Poland is losing sympathies in Germany. And also Johannes Ahlefeld asked about the general atmosphere. And I think with a growing frustration over Polish behavior, whether it's in the European Union, whether it's in the neighborship, there's less willingness if Poland comes with a certain agenda which is important to Poland to say, oh yeah, here we have a partner we should support and to whose wishes we should have open ears. That is human business. If people are friendly and forthcoming for you, you try to be more forthcoming to them and vice versa. And that is, I think, the main damage, that the goodwill of a lot of Germans, whether they have an official post in government or not, is a little bit reduced by the perception, how the Germans perceive the actions of peace and also President Duda.
Okay, so starting with sort of summing up round, I think we just talked with Michał about giving each and one of you a chance to have some final closing remarks. Just to throw these three issues out there, which maybe you'd like to address, and this is a plural you, depending on anybody who would like to address these issues. One is specifically on Polish-German relations in terms not of institutional contacts, but basically of the attitude of Polish society to Germans and Germany. Another question was about Poland's role in democracy promotion, especially in Belarus. And a third question, and this I'd address specifically to Wojtek, so that maybe in your closing remarks, Wojtek, you've spoken a lot about peace. Could you say a word about Trzaskowski, what this means for the opposition, and what this means for the rising star of the Polish opposition, if Trzaskowski is still that? So I don't know in what order we want to go. Maybe we'd start with Martin, and then just we're going to shout out your names, and you say whatever you want to say.
Sure, I can start. Just one main thought in a way, which is surprising to me here, is that we talk a lot about Polish-German relationship, but as Christoph just mentioned, I think a lot of things will happen rather in Brussels. And the way a lot of over the last couple of weeks in France in particular, the big question was whether after the economic recovery plan is implemented, the balance of power between Brussels and the member states will change on all kind of issues, not only on economic issues, but at one point, the one that has the power over the money has leverage. So it was also part of the French discussion on the future of Poland after the results of the election, is whether after COVID, Brussels will have more of a say and perhaps more leverage on internal affairs, not only in Poland, but in all member states, and whether this is something that we should consider more specifically, rather than thinking that Paris or Berlin will really chip in. It's more of a balance of power between Brussels and member states that we should discuss.
Okay, Susan, could we move over to you?
Sure, and I'm glad to see that Asia asked this question. I pragmatically, and particularly if it's a Trump administration, I think probably, and given President Duda's win, it's probably unlikely that we can expect much in terms of Poland's role in democracy promotion. But to paint, probably the most optimistic, rosy scenario that I will be probably proposing, particularly if there is a Biden administration, is Poland and the US used to have a very close relationship in terms of supporting democracy together. And, Poland understood that was important to the US relationship. So in a Biden administration, if President Duda understands that that's really important to the bilateral relationship, I see that there could be some potential there. In terms of Belarus, Poland had been one of our strongest partners in terms of supporting democracy in Belarus, and put in the frame of countering Russian influence. Belarus will continue to be, a border state there. One issue that we haven't really talked about is that in countering Russia, kind of the disinformation and how it's able to have outsized impact on democracies with disinformation and propaganda. That would be something that would be good to work on. And then finally, I'll just say that, a similar question was asking about, is there a chance for President Duda to be more independent? And, he is overseeing a split country. If he, hopefully a Biden presidency would encourage him to try to be more of a uniter and reach out to Trzaskowski supporters who are younger and seek some new solutions, and that could be something that the Biden administration could be encouraging ties to both sides of Poland, not just the peace administration and personalizing the relationship as Trump has done. So in the most optimistic scenario, and as I think Marek said, if the EU has a stronger pro-democracy group, there is a scenario where this is possible, but it's at this point not particularly likely.
Christoph?
Mute. Now I'm unmuted. No, just one last point, because we haven't yet talked about that. There is a certain stabilizer in the German-Polish relationship, which is economy and trade. And it is not without differences. I mean, there's always this Polish feeling that they don't want to be just the hinterland of the German economy, which delivers parts but has no real own impact. But on the other hand, even during Corona, Poland's place moved up in the hierarchy. Poland is now trade partner number 5. It overtook Great Britain and Italy in the last month. Whether that is going to stay is a different question, but even if they fall back to place 6 or 7, it is still an enormous, it is of enormous importance that we have this stable trade relationship. It's not just trade of goods, it is interconnected. Poland's economic success depends on Germany, and Germany's economic success also depends very much on Poland, and that is a good thing. And again, a lot of Germans are not aware of that. I hope in Poland there is a awareness of this fact.
Okay, thank you very much, Christoph. Marek.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, I would like to point your attention to one issue, which is linked to Poland's European, Poland's German positions, Poland's US position, that will actually take place in the coming weeks and that we haven't discussed yet in detail. That is how Poland navigates through the issue of relocation of the US troops. We can expect the Pentagon/White House report to the congressional committees in the coming weeks, especially taking into consideration that there will be an August break in the Congress. And the issue is really pressing on both sides. I mean, on all three sides, or maybe even 4 sides, because there is a NATO side as an institution towards that. So we can see a change of Poland's language in recent months and weeks, actually, or maybe even days, because even if it wasn't Polish intention, the impression was that Poland would be happy to capitalize on a decision which was widely regarded as detrimental to NATO. Now Poland communicates very clearly that it is not happy with that. And I would very much like to see what will be the end result of that, whether we will see at all any additional US troops moved from Germany to Poland, or the debate will actually take another direction in the coming months. This is my final things that I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka.
So from my side also, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I found it very fruitful also from our point of view. What I would like to reiterate specifically is perhaps this point that with regard to the future EU-Brussels relations, we are waiting very much to see which course the government will take, and there are a number of different options. However, there is also a certain path dependency with regard to how EU is being perceived currently or is being used. And I think there, especially the results of the elections, which is very much 50 towards closure Europe of nation states and 50%, almost 50% for people who are very much in favor of integration. There are some polling there is some polling which has shown that, in fact, among Trzaskowski voters, around 70% would be in favor of adopting the euro. This is something that should not be lost, especially given this perception of this election as a fork in the road. So there is a clear need, especially on European issues, which Martin has raised, especially when we think about the future, let's say, of engagement of European partners, not only at the state level, but also at, let's say, societal and local level, because there you might find more support for further integration ideas as well in the future. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Agnieszka and Wojtek. Your last words.
Thank you very much for the discussion, all the questions. When it comes to the opposition and the future of the opposition, when you take a look at the outcome of the presidential election, you might say that there are two more or less halves of the society and of the voters, but it's not completely true. This opposition's half is much. First of all, it's smaller, but also it's not as united as the ruling camp, and there will be lots of conflicts between the PO, the left, the Hołownia's movement, and so on, because all those parties will be looking for building their own identity. So it will be very hard for Trzaskowski to build a party or to take control of the party and beat peace in the foreseeable future. But on the other hand, his defeat doesn't mean an end of his career, because we have seen at least two major Polish politicians who lost presidential campaigns and then became very powerful politicians, and those names include Donald Tusk, who lost in 2005, and Jarosław Kaczyński, who lost in 2010. So nothing has ended for Trzaskowski, but he will have to fight his way into power.
Okay, if I can have one last remark and comment. I think very often we are asking ourselves, and you've asked us a number of times, will Andrzej Duda try to regain independence from Jarosław Kaczyński, from his party? I think this question is open, but whatever the answer to that question, there's one thing I think needs to be said. At the moment, we're looking at a sort of bird war in Poland between hawks and doves. And I'm not certain that if Andrzej Duda were to become independent of Jarosław Kaczyński, he would become a dove and he'd be with the dovish camp. I think that actually Andrzej Duda is something of a hybrid. I think he's either a hove or a dock, and we will find out only once he regains independence who he really is, because it's not certain from my perspective, from my point of view, that he would take Poland to the center and he'd take Poland back to Europe if he were to emancipate himself from Jarosław Kaczyński. So I wanted to say that, and I wanted to thank Michał Baranowski very much for the invite and for co-hosting this and for this initiative. So thank you, Michał, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrzej. And thank you all for joining us, those on the other side of the screen. Big thank you to our panelists. I hope that coming out from this discussion, you at least have a sense, because there was so much, but I learned a lot about possible scenarios, both for Poland's domestic developments, but also Poland's foreign relations. And we clearly see how much it depends also on the actions of our allies on the other side of the Atlantic, and our friends and partners and allies on this side of the Atlantic. So more to come. I, in this place, wanted to say huge thank you to Polityka Inside and the team. Thanks to Andrzej, but also thanks to Agnieszka, Marek, and Wojtek. And I think it was a really very fruitful way of being able to look from the inside out and from the outside in on Poland's place in Europe and the world. So thank you all. Stay safe. Have good vacation for those of you that leave a little bit, and see you sometime soon. Thanks. Ciao.